You're listening to the podcast Back to the Real, and I'm your host, Marcus Taylor. Welcome to the podcast Back to the Real, the podcast that discusses how movie influences us and also has an impact on us. My guest today is my friend and colleague, John Öwre, and he's here today to talk about how the 90s was the new 70s. Everybody ready? Cool. Hey, John.
Hello, Marcus.
Hey, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Tell me a little bit about yourself.
My name is John Öwre. I work at the English department, where you also work. I'm a former PhD student. Finished my PhD last fall. Yep. As I told you before, my expertise is not really in film, so I'm a literature scholar. But I've been watching movies for a very long time and been a film geek since 2003, so about 21 years. And so have you.
Absolutely. I mean, we have had so much fun conversations about movies at work, and we've been to some movie premieres together as well. So it feels like we always have much fun stuff to talk about regarding movies. So, and I feel we have a mutual favorite movie together as well.
We do, which might come up.
Exactly. That was my fault.
You planned it.
But so, John, so the custom is that the guest decides the topic that they want to talk about in this podcast. So my question to you is, what would you like to talk about today?
I would like to talk about the 90s. And when I pitched the idea to you, I said the 90s being the new 1970s, which I think there's a case to be made for that. But I would also like the conversation to revolve more around the uniqueness of the 90s and what maybe distinguishes it both from the 80s and from the era we are in today.
So this could be really fun. I'm really looking forward to it. So, all right, let's go.
Yeah.
So, what would you like to start with?
Well, I mean, should maybe start by stating my age. I was born in 1989. So I really only perceived the 90s through the eyes of a child. So I got the benefit of the amazing children's movies that were made during this period. We had the Disney Renaissance beginning in 1989 with The Little Mermaid and then continuing through the whole decade, which, I mean, beautifully realistically drawn films with ambitious themes, gorgeous music, and all of that. So I think it was a good formative period for someone to become interested in film. Just on that note. We had Don Bluth, who I think his glory period was ended just when Disney came back, but it still feels very much like the same type of film. I think also very idealistic, very enchanting movies, beautifully hand drawn and so on. And then we had Pixar coming around in the middle of the decade and so on. So I got that. At the time, I don't think I watched too many of the great non-animated movies until later. I watched some of them way earlier than I should have. Like I think I was 5 years old when I watched Jurassic Park for the first time, and Titanic as well. But I think, like most kids at the time, we were swept up in what was, in hindsight, probably the bigger technological revolution, which was the introduction of three-dimensional worlds in video games.
Exactly.
Which I'm sure you remember.
Exactly. I was just thinking when you actually said hand-drawn movies, then I think wasn't like Toy Story, the first Disney movie that was the first 3D animated.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember how people were talking about, is this the new future? Basically, this is how we're going to watch animated movies? Or is this just niche or something to start with? But looking at today, now it seems like hand-drawn movies are part of the past, but they're still being made, but they're not in the same volume as during the 90s. Yeah.
Or there are like combination technologies where they animate CGI the movements and then hand paint on top of them. It was a very, very different time. But I think I got all of the movies that we talk about today as the 90s classics a bit later when I was in high school and then got addicted to this decade.
So it came later on that you
it came a bit later on, which was probably good because then I had a purely I had a little bit of distance to the decade, and I could look at the more timeless aspects of it rather than being tainted too much by nostalgia, I think.
Yeah.
So, what were your memories of the 90s?
I remember mostly good things, but also bad things.
But personally?
Personally. But I would say there were... maybe not that much movie-wise. I remember some of the best movie memories I have were from the 90s because I remember not going... being born 83, of course I have some memories, but I think I started going more to the cinema just after the end of the 80s. Because I remember, I didn't see it in the movies, but I remember in 89 was like the huge mass hysteria about Batman, Tim Burton's Batman, coming to the cinema, and everybody was talking about Batman. I knew about Batman reading comic books and seeing pictures, but then there was a movie coming out with Batman, and I mean, my brother had like the Batman logo emblem on his, if I don't remember if it was his desktop or something that he was, but I mean, everybody had like jackets, they had T-shirts, it was Batmania basically. So that's one of my first memories, but that was exactly by the end of the 80s. But then in the 90s, like you said, it was the Disney era. Some of the, Bernard and Bianca in Australia was one of my first memories in the cinema. And then also lots of movies coming out in the 90s. I remember fondly. I remember talking about it in one of the podcasts, Apollo 13.
Oh yeah, that was really good.
That was, and then also Jurassic Park, like you mentioned, and all of these new kinds of adventure movies. And then especially the technology had become more and more advanced during the 90s as well, that you didn't have the same limits that you might have had during the 80s or the 70s, for that matter.
Right.
But so yeah, I would say I have many memories from especially the movies during the 90s. I think the 90s ended quite on a high note as well with
1999.
Yeah. That was a good movie year, and I think you know which movies I'm thinking about as well.
Yes, yes. Which weren't actually the movies that were talked about at the time.
No.
Like much of the discussion in 1999 were dominated by event movies and like the Blair Witch Project in particular, and also The Sixth Sense, which are both good movies. And the Blair Witch Project is brilliant, but I think the movies we talk about today were movies that were either lost in that noise or disappointed upon release, and one movie in particular.
It feels like we have to talk about this one. Should we start about now, or should we save it for later?
Yeah, we could.
I think the movie we both are thinking about is Stanley Kubrick's
Eyes Wide Shut, which I consider to be his best film. Yeah.
And I would actually say that I almost agree with you. It's a close second place, but first place for me is still The Shining. Yes, I think
they're very similar. I think they have the same. I think Eyes Wide Shut goes further in that mysterious, cryptic puzzle direction that The Shining started.
And that's what I love about that movie. And it's such a special movie. But then speaking of like your introduction, we talked about the 90s and the decades like the 80s and the 70s. I'm thinking about Stanley Kubrick, for example.
He's interesting, because he's not new Hollywood, really. He's an old Hollywood director who discovered himself in the 60s and 70s. He sort of spans across the eras, I think. I mean, it's you get this if you compare his 80s movies. I mean, he only made 2 movies in the 80s, and The Shining is really a new Hollywood 70s kind of thing that was left over for the 80s. I think if you compare Full Metal Jacket, released in 87, to Eyes Wide Shut, released in 99, as much as I like Full Metal Jacket, you can see him vibing with this new decade in a completely different way. He's like drawing on all his artistic resources in Eyes Wide Shut, and really, there's something almost magical about, and I mean magical in the literal sense. Like you feel like you're actually watching a kind of magician who is only hinting at what he's really doing in the movie, which I think is. I'm blown away by that film, and I'm glad it's starting to get its proper.
It feels like
credit.
Exactly. It feels like more and more people are starting to hear about the movie and start watching it as well. So it's become like a little renaissance for that movie now. I mean, more and more people are talking about it. It was maybe ahead of its time in some ways, but
it was and mismarketed completely, and also had the drawback of having its director die before he could
but that's actually
explain
funny.
What it was.
But that's actually funny that you mention that, because that's one of my a memory I have from the cinema. I think I was I don't even remember if it was Episode 1, Star Wars, that was going in the theaters at the same time. But I remember the teaser trailer came before that one for Eyes Wide Shut. And it's the famous teaser when you basically see nude Nicole Kidman undressing in front of the mirror. I remember, what's this movie about? And you hear music playing, bad thing.
Precisely, yeah.
Bad thing.
But I mean, they were desperately trying to save a movie that I think they didn't understand at that point. They had no one to explain it to them. And it was completely mismarketed. Yeah. There was also, Brian Raftery talks about this in his book about 1999, about all the weird fan speculation that was going on about, are they psychiatrists who are sleeping with their patients? What is this? What is the story about? Like, people were very confused, and many of them expected some sort of Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman marriage vehicle that would sort of generate gossip and so on.
Because they made two movies together, like also in the 90s. You had like Days of Thunder, and then you had Far and Away.
Right, yeah.
No, not Far and Away.
Something like that.
Something, so they were more like romantic. For the first one, a bit more action drama, and then you had the historical drama, and then suddenly Eyes Wide Shut. Third time's the charm. what would you like to say? But it was very interesting, and that movie has grown on me, like you said,
so much.
Every time I rewatch it, I see more and more details that I might have missed the first time, and it's just a bit of a hypnotic feel to it when you watch it. You get immediately drawn into it, and you can't stop watching.
I agree. I mean, I completely agree that it grows on you, even as I would also say that there is something special about the first viewing when you have no idea what's going to happen. Because I remember I watched this movie before my driving test between 2 a.m. in the morning and 4:30 in the morning. Not a good decision in hindsight. But I remember I had no expectations. It was on SVT, and I was just staying up. It was Friday or whatever. And I thought, okay, after 10 minutes, I thought this movie started strong, and it's just getting better and better with every scene. I've never seen anything like it. Like you'd think it would hit some sort of high and then trail off, but it just gets more and more mysterious and strange and wonderful with every scene. And part of that comes from just genuinely having no idea where you're going. Like, you're following him on this night trek through New York, and then basically throw away his life over the course of a night. Then I think after the Nicole Kidman's dream confession, when it switches to daytime, there's a slight hangover where the movie has to shift into a lower gear to sober him up a little bit so that he can go find out what happened, which is, I think, if Kubrick could have found a way to get around that and just make the movie end with this dreamlike mood in some way, it wouldn't have been the same movie, but I don't know where I'm going with this, but I think he switched to a critical mode where he wanted to expose the illusions that he's created, and for
No, I agree with you. But this might be a tricky question. But I was thinking, can you, when you watch the movie, do you think it represents a certain part of the 90s as well? Things going on in society? Does it have like a message to the viewers that are watching it, especially during that time?
It's a good question. I mean, it's based on an Austrian novella from 1926 called Traumnovelle by Arthur Schnitzler.
I did not know that.
And it's very much drawing on the evocation of 1920s Vienna. Because if you look carefully, it doesn't really feel like New York. It feels very mannered, very elegant, and old world in a way. So I think it's a kind of old world Europe crossed with contemporary New York. Then at the same time, Stanley Kubrick's favorite book was a book called The Code Breakers, I think. No, it's a book about secret codes and ciphers throughout history. It's a thick, very in-depth book about that. And this is something that comes out a little bit in how he designs The Shining, where he takes an interest in ciphers and hidden messages. And Eyes Wide Shut has a lot of hidden messages in when characters do this double tap, for instance, with different objects and so on. So I'm sure we could speculate about what has come out about Hollywood since then and how much Stanley Kubrick probably knew.
Exactly.
Secret societies in Bohemian Grove, and not to mention sort of the Epstein circle, which would have been in New York at the time.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I have no certain knowledge about this.
But I remember Kubrick as both as a director, writer, but also a bit of a character as well, because there was so much mystery surrounding him well. Remember, like what you said with hidden messages in his movies as well. There was a theory going on that he had shot the moon landing in '69.
Oh yeah, I remember.
For example, and that much buzz surrounding that, if it really happened or if that was just bogus in a way. But then he slightly added in, I think it was The Shining, something about the carpet and the framing there, that it was supposed to symbolize the Apollo 11 mission.
Yeah.
You know which one I'm referring to?
I've heard something about this. Yeah.
But like you said, hidden messages, hidden details, that when you rewatch movies, especially his movies, you see those details and you're thinking, why did he put them there?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And there's, it also feeds off of the myth of how hyper controlling he was on set. Like you knew that nothing was accidental. I think if of all the auteurs, he's the one who left the least to chance. Yeah. Maybe him and like Wes Anderson. So I think when someone is that deliberate about everything that's happening in the movies, it's easy to maybe I don't know, maybe overanalyze. I think we also have to leave. We also have to remember that artists very often draw on unconscious ideas or things that are not completely systematized, and that those are often the ones that become the best projects.
Absolutely, I totally agree.
And Eyes Wide Shut in particular is very much also a kind of Freudian chaos of a movie, which you could also say about the original novella. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's fun to speculate. I also think we should hold back on like the most extreme.
It feels like we can go on hours and hours about that movie. But speaking of what you said in the beginning about the 90s, and then you had the decades of the 80s and the 70s, what comes to the top of my mind was, which I also have many good memories from, was especially in 97 when the Star Wars trilogy came back to the big screen. It was the 20th anniversary, and the special editions were released. And I remember as a child being so, oh my God, I'm going to watch them in the cinema for the first time, because I hadn't done that before. They weren't. I mean, I had like an old, worn-out VHS tapes that I had the movies on, now being the possibility of seeing it on the big screen. Right. But then I was thinking like, okay, now it feels like there's a revival going on again from this movie being made in the 70s, 77 to be, and then Empire Strikes Back in the 80s, and also Return of the Jedi. So it had 2 decades there. Yeah. And then now being re-released and being a huge hit again, which then was followed by the new trilogy with Episode 1 premiering also in 1999. So
that's true. Yeah. I see that, even as I'm also aware of the mythology of Star Wars as being one of the 3 or 4 movies that sort of brought New Hollywood down indirectly by being so successful. Yeah. So I don't know where I would align that decade-wise, because the Star Wars phenomenon also was very much an 80s phenomenon. I think that's when I mean, it was a sensation right away, but The Empire Strikes Back took it also to a different level, and culturally it feels very 80s. It's very much a sort of coddled Reagan era optimism about the future and his own Star Wars initiatives and so on. So I also think of the prequels maybe as they feel very much like a kind of Bush era thing as well.
Absolutely, that's very evident, at least in the third one, I would say.
Yeah.
But it was just interesting to see when we're talking about how the 90s got influenced by
the
70s, and just seeing how things came back to life again that had their origin in the 70s, for example.
Right. Yeah.
So it just came up top of my mind.
Yeah.
But so that's interesting. But then speaking of cool memories from the 90s, I remember if I remember, for example, Independence Day.
Yeah. No, it's very 90s movie. It's
it feels like that really had like the 90s printed on it. It was also one of I think it was the second movie with Will Smith that really made him into a huge star. We had done Bad Boys was before Independence Day, and then he did this one, and I remember seeing it on the screen for the first time. It was like a huge budget sci-fi action movie, and a really adventure movie. Then before that, I remember I didn't see it in the cinema, but I saw it just afterwards, like also by Roland Emmerich, Stargate.
Oh, I missed that.
You missed that one. Yeah, you were a bit too young for that, but I remember that. It felt like during the 90s that this was a new wave of adventure movies coming, and then Stargate, as you know, turned into a TV series as well by the end of the 90s. So it feels like it was a new renaissance going on.
There was a renaissance for adventure movies and disaster movies, which is another thing I think that was unique about the 90s. It was so all end of century, much like the 1890s. There is a lot of end of the world stuff going on in this period.
I was about to say that actually, because that's what I remember from seeing movies from the 70s. Lots of disaster movies. Towering Inferno, Airport 78, 79, 80. There were huge movies made. They all had the disaster theme. I was like, did people really go and watch this for fun?
Well, it was a turbulent time. I mean, there was like a financial crisis for most of the decade, and then it got even worse near the end.
I can then understand why people wanted to go to see Star Wars for the escapism. But
True,
then, But then going to watch it, even leaving the theater even more like, what did I just watch?
Yeah.
I'm more depressed now.
No, but you're right. By the late 70s, people had enough. That's also, if you see many of the great movies from the early 80s, which flopped, many of them flopped because they were too dark and too they weren't escapism. So John Carpenter's The Thing, for instance, it's considered one of the greatest horror movies ever made, but at the time some critics called it one of the worst films ever made. They said it was cynical, nihilistic, like anti-human, and much of it came from the sense of there was a global crisis. There was a huge shift in values. People wanted comfort. They wanted optimism. And I think that's also one of the reasons why the original New Hollywood disappeared. Like, people blamed overambitious projects by directors with huge egos at the time, which when you actually watch those movies, like Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate and One from the Heart by Francis Ford Coppola and a couple of others, they're quite good. There's nothing wrong with them. If they were released today, they would be head and shoulders over much more movies. But it was easy to blame diva directors who the producers wanted to get rid of anyway, when I think the real reason was a shift in values, economic crisis, the culture was shifting.
Absolutely.
So that's, I think, another thing that happens in the 90s. So you have a decade in the 80s of producers instilling their values in movies. So there were so many taboos about what you couldn't do in movies. You couldn't have characters that were too unsympathetic, or you couldn't have that kind of rebel vibe that you saw in new Hollywood movies. And so I think starting with like 91, 92, you see a very consciously designed anti-producer movie coming along, which prides itself on using profanity, like F words and excessive violence, amoral characters, and so on. And Quentin Tarantino maybe is the poster boy for that trend, where I think you can see why this was cathartic after a while. But I also think one of the sort of flaws of the 90s was that they maybe overcorrected a little bit too far in that direction, and you got a lot of filth for the sake of filth, and but yeah, no, it became a badge of freedom. Like, we can do whatever we want, we can say whatever we want.
Speaking of a movie that comes to my mind that I remember was being also very huge at the time and was a big sensation. You talked about an era of time during the 80s, for example. I'm thinking about the Cold War, with the tensions between Russia and the United States. And speaking of that one of my favorite movies that came out in the 90s as well, that dealt with it but in a different way, was GoldenEye.
Yeah.
James Bond. It was the first movie with Pierce Brosnan. It was the first movie made in the 90s as well. It was like I think it was like a 6-year gap between License to Kill. And so, but then the cool thing is that it takes place during the 80s in the beginning, but then it's in present time in 95. And then the Cold War is over. This is a new world. When they say at some point in the movie that Bond is a relic of the Cold War, and they say how he has to now adapt to this new world, and especially we as moviegoers finding new interesting scripts for the character James Bond to appear in. But I remember that it was a huge hit when it came, and then especially the Nintendo 64 game coming out as well. I mean, I don't know, I can't count how many hours I spent playing that game. Playing it together. It was a first-person shooter where you could play together with other friends, and but just thinking about me being a big Bond fan, I saw lots of the Bond movies when I was a child as well. I still enjoy them very much. But I remember just seeing a new Bond movie, Pierce Brosnan, from whom I know as Remington Steele before, now playing James Bond, and then turning out to be a really cool Bond movie.
It was. I mean, it's an unusually good Bond movie, like objectively speaking. I think, and you're right. It's a very odd project because it's about a Cold War that no longer exists. I think that also is what makes it feel a bit more. It feels much less political. It feels like
exactly.
It's just an abstract fight between bad guys and good guys.
But thinking about what we talked about, because it felt like it was a message of society, how the movies back then were, especially during the 70s and the 80s, even for, like back to the 60s as well, of course. But then doing the first one in the 90s, how it took a new direction, and it paid off.
It did
really well as well. So I just find it very interesting that how the 90s had successful reintegrations or reintroducing a character, especially in a movie, one of the largest movie franchises ever.
I agree. I'm thinking, are there other examples of this? Because the same director also brought back Zorro a few years later.
Did I not know about that one? Antonio Banderas.
I have fond memories of that, but I was 9 years old. So.
It's a fun movie. It's a fun movie.
Good music.
It's good music as well, and it's a good sequel as well. But yeah.
But yeah, you're right. It was a weird political moment. I think if you were, I think you could say that the cinematic 90s ends maybe when the Twin Towers fall and America gets back its sense of having an enemy out there in the world. Yeah. So if there's something that happens from the way in which America, for better or worse, one should say, had unchallenged hegemony and sort of had a sense of loss in the world. Like, who are we at this moment in time? So 90s movies, I always felt became introspective in a way that 80s movies weren't, and maybe movies in the aughts weren't really to the same extent. They became more interested in psychological problems, you could say. They become more interested in things like, as we talked before, magic, in a very literal sense. So if you look at, for instance, magic in 80s movies, it's very domesticated. It's very wink, wink.
Absolutely.
Like a little toy or something. If you think of Big, where it's like Zoltan vanished to the edge of some amusement park, or in like Gremlins with a Chinese shop owner who has these magical creatures and everything. It's not literal. No. It's a device that's meant to create a certain.
What are you
story.
saying? Are the Mogwais not real? Sorry. Sorry. Keep on going.
Whereas I think in the 90s, and I'm not. I suspect Twin Peaks may have played a role here, in many ways, but you get a different kind of films about the supernatural. Yeah. And here. I don't know. Are you familiar with a South African director named Richard Stanley?
I recognize the name, but can you give me an example of it?
He made a movie called Hardware, which was kind of a Terminator ripoff.
And
then a movie called Dust Devil about a drifter in South Africa.
Yeah, I haven't seen them, but I know which one you're referring to now. Yeah, but you've seen them.
I've seen them, and I think he represents the anarchic. Wild 90s for me, because I couldn't imagine him really existing in the 80s in the same way. But he's the kind of figure where I think he's a genius. I just don't think he's necessarily a genius filmmaker. He has some kind of genius which if he lived in an earlier era, he would have been an alchemist or something. But because he lives in this time, he had to monetize it somehow, so he became a filmmaker. I think Hardware has some flaws. It's stuck in a kind of sci-fi convention that it can't quite deliver on. But Dust Devil is something magical. It feels like it's really clued into some old archetypal mystical language. So I would absolutely really recommend that.
But now when you mentioned, you said ripoff of Terminator, that's also one of my biggest memories. I was absolutely too young to have watched it. I think I was 9 years old or something when I saw Terminator 2, Judgment Day. But I just remember, what a cool movie. And it also was a bit of hysteria when it was going to be released again. There's a new Terminator movie coming out 7 years later, and James Cameron was directing and writing. And so I can remember the buzz about that movie as well. So, but it feels like the most movies I remember at the time then, like you said, was more of the big blockbuster movies, the action movies, the adventure movies that I feel I have more connections to, more than the smaller drama indie movies, for example. But at the same time, I've remember seeing lots of good, more smaller movies that also had an impact as well, but not as huge as maybe those kind of movies. I have more memories of them, especially what was going on in society as well, and especially how people were talking about it, and friends were talking. We were playing in the playground with certain movies, for example, as well, like imitating characters and stuff like that. So.
Well, many of those, the smaller movies were, I think, discovered later also. They were, because that's, of course, the other thing about the 90s. It was the rise of the independent film, largely thanks to Miramax and
exactly. Weinstein. You talked about Tarantino as well, being one of the new upcoming auteurs as well, doing his brand of movies, if you can call it that, especially coming with. I remember, I think for me was first Pulp Fiction. That was the first one I got in contact with.
But I'm slightly younger than you, so for me it was Kill Bill. But no, I mean Tarantino he was friends with Harvey Weinstein, so he got to he never had his movies re-edited in the way that, for instance, Richard Stanley was. He had the misfortune of having some conflicts with Harvey Weinstein. So one of the reasons Richard Stanley never got, I think, the reputation he deserved was that Dust Devil, which I consider to be his best film, was completely butchered by Miramax and turned into a cut that completely changed the plots of the movie, and which critics hated.
It was the same with Studio 54, but it came just, I think it was 2000, 2001. I remember it was also lots of writing about that he had gone in and changed lots of the original script and then reshot stuff as well.
Yeah.
So,
but it did the same with Gangs of New York, it turns out. It's the reason it's so messy is that he had so many ideas.
But that's an interesting point that you now said, because that's, for me, is also very 90s to me when it comes to movies, especially Miramax. Because I remember there were lots of good drama that they produced, and very, very good movies. There were, English Patient, I think, was also one of my favorites. And I mean, coming into contact with more depth in movies as well, and these more personal stories as well. And for me, the 90s felt like Miramax was very part of, and always was in the background for many of the movies that also won lots of prizes as well during this award ceremonies, for example.
He did. I mean, Harvey Weinstein took aim very much at that. Like you wouldn't expect it, but when one of his specializations was like Regency costume dramas and Jane Austen adaptations and that sort of thing. So, I mean, you could say he did cinema a favor in some ways by producing those types of films. He also did many upcoming filmmakers a great disservice by completely destroying their works in the editing room. And he even tried with Hayao Miyazaki, I think. And Hayao Miyazaki sent him back a samurai sword with a little note that said no cuts. So I think he, his presence looms over this decade for better and worse. And then what was discovered later, of course.
But speaking of the 90s, I'm just thinking, did you speak very fondly of the 90s? That you, like you said, that you rediscovered it when you were a bit older as well. Can you give an example? I mean, you've given us some examples already, but I was just thinking on the top of my mind, what would you say would be the best thing that you can remember with the 90s regarding movies? Was it like the connections you felt to at the time you were watching them as a child, for example? Or was it later on that you saw movies that you hadn't experienced, but seeing it with fresh eyes as an adult? What made you feel a connection with that time?
I think it's so many things. Like it's so personal to me, and I'm viewing it so up close.
Yeah, but that is,
so I would have to give multiple answers.
Yeah, but please do, because that's what I find so interesting about people's connection to movies. So feel free. Start with one. You mentioned the Disney movies, for example, at first. But I was thinking like that was maybe more when you were more as a child.
Yes. So to me, today my taste would be much more toward independent films and many films that actually quite a lot of European films coming from. That's the other thing, that French cinema had a huge revival in the 90s. So, I mean, it's corny to use a term like authenticity or
no,
like,
it's not corny.
Realism, but there was an aspiration toward a kind of ideal. No, I'm not going to use.
Are you thinking about realism, or are you thinking when you say
more? How shall I put this? So, if you look at movies today, for instance, I think there are many people blame the financial incentives of filmmakers and the production companies and so on for why movies were bad. But there's also something different in filmmaking culture and the aesthetics of how movies are made. For one thing, I think movies today are very unconcerned about evoking literal worlds, like worlds that feel like worlds. If you take an example like the Dune movies, for instance.
Yeah.
They take place in a desert, but it's not just that for me, it doesn't ever even feel like a desert, and it feels like it's not supposed to feel like a desert. Mm-hmm. It's more like an archetype. There are dunes. They are sort of grayish in color. The weather looks like it might be northern Finland or somewhere. Yeah. It looks like the characters are walking around in a kind of almost like an art installation, which is a conscious stylistic decision. Yeah. But it also means we've stopped trying to create worlds that can be understood in a literal sense. Like you're not really supposed to be transported to Arrakis. No. I think you're supposed to see it as a movie world. I also think that we write characters differently. Actors perform characters differently. Yep. Characters today are much more likely to be types, where they represent like either collective interests or some kind of thesis about the world, and then the task of the actor is to deliver that with as little superfluous acting as possible. Yeah. And I think overall, movies today have become more theoretical. Yeah. They have. If you read modern screenplays, they often have like the structure of a thesis in a way that they didn't before. Okay. It's an intellectual argument where here's a thesis, here's a counter thesis. In the end, we arrive at this conclusion, which I think is in part a result of things like film Twitter and the discourse that's going on at all times, where filmmakers might feel like they have to get on top of the conversation about the movie as quickly as possible and steer it in a certain way, and to not be misunderstood. But I think it's made for movies that are more abstract and more like they're not actually meant to be. They're not meant to be taken literally on any level. No. They are like, Yeah.
Whereas, exactly. I mean, just thinking, like, would you say that that's one of the biggest differences, for example, from which you feel like represent the 90s?
I mean, it's not. It's obviously not true of everything that was made in the 90s. But one of the more exciting things for me was in 1994, the French television commissioned a TV show about coming of age stories in France. It's called Tous les garçons, le fil, something, and they commissioned a bunch of young directors to make one episode each, about an hour long. Yeah. And the stipulations were that it had to be set between the years 1960 and 1990, and it had to have a specific song in it. And watching those episodes now, it was broadcast on television, but they feel like movies, and there were like movie directors who were commissioned to do them. It's like it feels like you're watching something by a different culture. It's so close to authentic teenage experience, the kind of feelings that you might have, the kind of conversations you would have. That I think we just lack the touch that would let us make that kind of film today. Exactly. So. That would be one thing, I think.
But that was a very good example, I would say, definitely. But speaking of, like you said, like trying to reinvent movies, for example, it feels like it's a very different time now from the 90s, especially now with all the streaming services that are available now, and especially now technology has advanced. We remember we were talking about it in a former podcast episode as well, that TV series now that are mainly on streaming services has the possibility now they look like big budget movies now. Yeah. And there's basically no end to the possibilities. And I think this has become a format now that people are more comfortable with watching at home, for example, or watching, still getting a cinematic feeling depending on what kind of equipment they have at home. But like we've read the last couple of years now that cinema is struggling at the moment, especially movie production companies are really struggling now of getting moviegoers to go to the cinema. And what I find very interesting now, at least the last 2 years now after the pandemic, which movies actually become huge box office successes and which do not. So it feels like there's a shift going on there as well, because if you look at it, it feels like if you refer to the 90s, there was more like the big budget, huge action-packed movies, the adventure movies, fantasy. They were the biggest successes at the time as well. It was very reminiscent of the 80s, like you said. But now it feels like, yeah, there's still big, huge box office movies that come out, but they don't get the revenue that they thought they would from start.
No.
And there's been so many movies now just this year that has, I wouldn't say flop, but they didn't at all turn out the way that they thought they would be. That these were going to be the biggest box office hits for the year, but no, that didn't happen. And then the year before, like 2023, you had Barbie and Oppenheimer going against each other, and they were the biggest movies of that year financially.
Yeah.
But then I don't think that anybody was expecting it to be that huge of a deal. But then you had like other sci-fi movies, you had like action movies that basically flopped.
Yeah, I mean, with Barbenheimer, I think the message was relatively clear.
Yeah.
Like they were original stories; they weren't sequels or remakes. And Barbie was based on a toy, but it felt like a very 2023 like movie.
So that's what I'm thinking about. Like we've talked about now, when you said about 90s being the new same, how things come back again. Was like the 90s felt like that was a bit of a start of the sequel area. That's
the flip side of it. But there was one difference, I think. So as you say, there were huge blockbusters every year, and of a kind that hadn't been possible before based on technology. But there's one difference, and that technology was actually developing a little bit every year. Yeah. So when we think of a summer blockbuster, we think of something big, noisy, based on a brand. But in the 90s and early aughts, the selling point was that you were going to see something that wouldn't have been possible a year before.
No, exactly.
So people would go to a movie in the middle of the summer. Like in 93, you had Jurassic Park, for instance, and then 95, Toy Story fits the same category, then later Titanic and so on, where the idea was that even if you didn't respond to anything else, you could just sit there and just marvel at what computers can do. And so I think you that gave birth to a genre that had these long scenes of like long action scenes, long suspense scenes, where you were supposed to just sit there and wonder. But now that technology has stopped developing, those scenes have kind of lost their function because nobody goes to see Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom expecting to see new technology necessarily. No. So you have all these noisy special effects driven scenes that don't have any novelty anymore.
No, you're right. You're right. But that's an interesting thing that you mentioned now. Me, as you know, being a huge Nolan fan, for example, Christopher Nolan fan. That's one thing that I found so interesting, especially with Oppenheimer, because he to me is a product of old Hollywood, if you know what I mean. Especially he values the practical setups. He values the old ways of doing movies, especially. And seeing that Oppenheimer had basically no computer-generated images whatsoever. Everything was shot on location and practically done. That you can still make these kind of movies, and as long as you have like you said, exactly. That's the common, that it's an original story. And then it becomes a box office hit. Yeah. So it's very interesting where we are going at the moment now, and how the movie studios has to try and reinvent themselves. Like you've mentioned about writing the scripts, that it just not is enough to just have take us from point A to point B. You have to do other stuff there in between as well. And then what kind of movies would the studios like to produce from now on? Right. So I find that a very interesting discussion to have, especially yeah, like we've talked about, what we grew up with, especially during the 90s, like we've talked about now, because it feels like we're entering a new era now, and especially how the movies are going to survive, especially what do we want as an audience globally want to watch, and what kind of movies can be financial, big box office hits, basically.
Yeah. No, it's a dilemma. The movies have gotten super expensive to make and promote. And as some people have already said, like the mid-budget movie isn't profitable anymore because you don't have DVD sales anymore. No. So back in the days, you could take a risk on something just because it starred a particular actor. But these days, at least the received wisdom is that a movie has to be profitable in the first couple of weeks. Otherwise, it's a flop. Yeah. Which means you get these brand-based movies or sequels and prequels because the brand itself will drag people to watch it, even if there's nothing else to care about.
Exactly, because to me personally, I think that's one of the issues today, that we're relying too much. That maybe started a bit more in the 90s, but that the studios rely too much on franchises, especially then having sequels, prequels, reboots, and then just create something new. Yeah. And look back at 2023, like you said, Barbie and Oppenheimer feels like those are the two movies that really stand out. And I mean, maybe look into that and tap into that as well for the upcoming years of cinema.
Yeah. No, I mean, and then it became shared universes, so which I completely agree. And I partially blame television a little bit. Like movies want to emulate the subscription model where you sign up for endless entertainment rather than just buy one ticket. And the kind of addictive algorithms that everyone sort of uses online. But also, like, Hollywood producers have become more conservative, and they're governed by, all the movie studios are owned by big conglomerates that follow Wall Street dictates about how to generate profits. And I think, there are too many obstacles in the way of good movies right now, and I wonder sometimes if the best way forward would be to create an independent content. I hate the word content, but film-making platform online where you could where you could make your own movies cheaply and then distribute them yourself somehow.
Oh, really?
I don't know.
That's interesting.
If it,
Any thoughts? You're thinking like it would be easier for young filmmakers.
You would get around all the machinery of movies costing tens of millions of dollars, even if they look like small independent movies, and all the costs associated with distribution and so on. I don't know. I've started thinking that might be the way forward for everything, including book publishing and so on. You have to escape the machinery.
So by doing it more by yourself, basically.
By yourself, and then it's a very half-formed idea, but maybe in the future.
But absolutely, I think it's very interesting that you point out. So, okay, but it feels like we could go on for hours and hours talking about this. I find it so fascinating. But I'm thinking about, but maybe as a last thought about the 90s. What would you see? I was thinking about remembering the 90s. I talked about my memories, but especially now thinking about things that when you look back to it, and then versus the things that you actually experienced as a 90s kid as well. What would you say are your more fondest memories that you have from the decade that you feel like you haven't experienced now in the present time?
Do you mean like an actual memory or a movie watching experience?
I would say both, actually. I can just say just an example. I've mentioned a couple, but I was thinking like a movie experience. The first Matrix movie had a huge impact on me. But that's also a big Hollywood blockbuster movie. But I remember then when you talked about the technological aspects, but as a experience of going to the cinema. That's something I can miss now when I go to the cinema, and having that experience of going into the world, like we talked about escapism. That's what I really enjoy watching. Those kind of movies that make me escape the real world and just for an hour or two make me think about being somewhere else and having that experience.
Right.
And I haven't felt that for some time. I mean, there are, of course, movies I've seen in the cinema that I've had a really nice experience in the cinema, but it was a long time since I had that kind of, and that was mostly during the 90s, I would say, especially those formative years as well for me personally. But I was thinking, like, you growing up as a kid as well, but then afterwards, like you said, rewatching it, would you say as a movie experience, could you still
I'm going to go the opposite route and focus on the very small movies that we haven't heard of today, because I think that's the other side of the 90s, is that those movies were suddenly made possible. And this might also double as a recommendations for the viewers.
Yeah.
There a couple of movies. Earlier this year, actually, I watched a film that is practically unknown. It's called Frost. It's a German film.
Okay, it's not the Disney movie.
It's not a Disney movie. It is a punishingly long, slow, 3.5 hour long independent film made by Fred Kellerman, the cinematographer who worked on Bela Tarr's movies.
Yeah.
And it's a film about a young child and his mother, who they go on a trek through East Germany on Christmas Day. To escape this abusive father, and in search for something better, and it's such a dreamlike, dark journey, which comes so close to seeming real, but at the same time has a kind of allegorical undertone to it, as a Christmas story of the nativity of Mary being turned down and so on, and ends in a party scene about the frictions that underlie East and West Germany. I would say it's one of the most perfect films I've ever seen. And as I was watching it, I was almost hoping it wouldn't be so as perfect as I thought it would, because the thought of this movie being so unknown made me angry. That how can you make a film that towers over almost everything else, and it still doesn't have proper distribution? It still languishes on streaming websites where which you have to access sometimes. So my fondest memories are discovering these types of movies that are just out there, completely unknown, and most of which were made in the 90s, I would say. So I would say Fred Kellerman's Frost, an Italian director named Franco Piavoli, very much making movies in the vein of Terrence Malick. Yeah. He made an adaptation of the Odyssey in a completely fictional old Mediterranean language. It's a cross between Latin and ancient Greek, told just through very simple images of water and adventure and everything. It's called Nostos: The Return. He also made a film about his childhood called Voices in Time, also beautiful, gorgeous. One of the weirdest Japanese films I've ever seen called August in the Water, which I can only describe as a cross between a high school drama, a story about all things being connected on a subatomic level, and a war between air and earth. Sort of
you sold it to me.
It's a kind of Buddhist cosmic epic with school kids in Japan. Also not quite as unknown as the others, but another movie about the mystical 90s, about this sort of new spiritual awareness that sort of came up everywhere. And what else?
We have to watch that one. You sold it now. I'm in.
So yeah, those would be my fondest memories. Just logging onto a streaming website, finding these completely unknown movies, which are everywhere, and seeing that they're so much better than what we have today. So that's what I'm saying. Everyone should explore the 90s at their own pace, through their own interests, and you will all find something, I think.
Cool. All right, John. thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. I had a really nice time.
So did I.
So now I have lots of movies that I had to check out now. So
we have a long list.
We have a long list to go through. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. If you enjoyed listening to the podcast, please remember to click like and subscribe. It helps me with the channel and it also helps me create more content. Thank you.